was recently published, and I thought it would be such a great idea to feature this novel and Tony's work on our Meet the Author events. So today, Tony is going to talk about Have a Heart, and it is so significant that we are featuring this novel in February, which is a month of Saint Valentine. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Tony, and I'm going to ask you, since it is so interesting that we are talking about hearts and love and Valentine's this month, could you tell us where the title of your novel derives from? And what does Have a Heart mean in the context of the plot of your novel?
Well, thank you. Well, first of all, good morning, America. I guess good afternoon, UK. And good evening or good night, Mumbai. And wherever else, whatever the time zone we are talking about. First of all, I would like to express my gratitude to the committee at Pico Library for featuring me and my book. And a special thanks to Rochelle, as well as to Christine for organizing this event. Well, in answer to your first question, we have romanticized the heart, linking it to metaphorically, to love and other emotions for a very long time. And it actually started with the ancient Egyptians. In their worldview, the heart, or ib, was actually part of the soul. It was the source of intelligence, as it was for the Mesopotamians and the Babylonians, as well as the Greeks. The oldest Hindu scriptures, the Vedic texts, considered the heart as Hridaya, or center, a light of consciousness, the abode of the soul and of Brahma. Of course, in Catholicism, we have the Sacred Heart of Jesus and the Immaculate Heart of Mary. In this novel, the title has triple meaning. Number one, it's an expression of compassion, and you'll find that throughout the novel. But there is one striking example when Brad, who was known to Ali, and Ali had a lot of conflict in deciding whether he should give his wife's heart as a transplant donor. When he met Brad told him that her friend Nancy, her friend Mary, had willed her heart to Anna. And then the protagonist is very moved, and he expresses, here is love, here is religion, here is God, right here. The other is that transplant itself, give a heart, have a heart. And for a sick and dying patient, you see, it is a gift of life. To have a heart means to live. So I had this title in my mind right from the beginning, and I never wavered in answer to your question.
Okay, so would you like to tell us a little bit about the plot for those of our participants who have not read the novel, Tony?
Sure. Well, the novel is mostly based in New York. And it does go a little bit, there are some scenes in Pakistan, in St. Petersburg, Russia, in Las Vegas, and in Machu Picchu. And the three main protagonists Anna, who is a Russian ballerina, who defects to America. And it turns out that over time, she collapses at Lincoln Center at the Metropolitan whilst dancing Swan Lake. And Ali is in the audience with his mother. Ali was a ballet aficionado, and he actually danced ballet when he was a kid, but his father was somewhat against it. He wanted him to become a doctor. And Anna turns out to have heart failure, and she has a cardiac arrest and ultimately is in need of a transplant. And it so happens that the next morning, Ali was in the audience when she collapsed, and he is called on a consultation, and then the doctor-patient relationship begins. The other character is Nancy. Ali had a relationship with Anna, but it never worked out because of a variety of reasons. Some of it was cultural, but I think the most important was the fact that she reversed back into heart failure, and she wanted very much that Ali continue being her doctor. So Ali does get married to an American woman, analyst who works at the World Trade Center. And so the novel, describes the romantic and professional lives of these three individuals and how they interact with each other. And of course, at the end comes 9/11. The rest, obviously, you will have to read to find out.
Yeah, well, I'm glad that you mentioned 9/11 and talked about Nancy working in the World Trade Center. A few years ago, Tony, I had attended a reading by my favorite novelist, who was Ian McEwan. And he had made a comment and said that he expected that novels about the tragedy of the terrorist attacks of 9/11 would only be written 20 years after the event. And I find it uncanny that your novel sort of meets his expectations to the T. So I'm wondering what made you write a novel about this historical catastrophe at this time? And how did it come out when it did? How did your novel come out when it did?
That's a very good question. Obviously the novel is published 20 years later, and I guess in concert with Ian's perception, he probably felt that it was a bit too raw for it to come out, to be written or to come out earlier. And I do realize that some people's sensitivities to a tragic event may bring about some sort of issues. However, I didn't write this novel now. I started the novel about, I would say about 4 to 5 years after 9/11.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Okay.
And the revision process,
I see,
the rewriting and the rewriting and the rewriting and the reorganization spanned almost 10 years.
Yeah.
And of course, you see, I was working full time at that time as a cardiologist and electrophysiologist. So I wrote it in between patients, in between procedures. If I had to write it now, I think it would be a much shorter time, because I'm now semi-retired and can dedicate much more to writing than in the past. Furthermore, the catastrophe of 9/11 had impacted me since I dropped my wife, who was then my girlfriend, that morning at the World Trade Center at about 7:45 to 8 o'clock. And she worked on the 56th floor of the South Tower. And she was there when the plane hit the North Tower. And she started coming down. She managed to take the elevator to a certain floor and then walk down the steps when her building was hit as well. So she was there at that time, but managed to take the last train that left the sub-basement. There was a subway service to the World Trade Center. So she took the last train and escaped. So in essence, the World Trade Center, the 9/11 had significance to me as well. Either directly or indirectly, I was a part of it. And I thought that I would weave this history within the context of the novel.
Yeah, I think that was one of the toughest things to read in this novel, really, those bits that deal with the aftermath of the tragedy. Every single one of us remembers where we were when the tragedy of 9/11 occurred. And I was actually teaching that morning at NYU. I saw the first plane hit the first tower. And afterwards, when classes came to a standstill, of course, I stood with my students right on Mercer Street, just a few blocks away from the World Trade Center, and actually watched the towers fall, holding on to the hands of my students, who I recall were just weeping. So we can all remember what happened at that time. And I think it's so interesting that you say that, in fact, you had a personal association with this character in your book, who actually goes through exactly what you've described, trying to come down the stairs. I'm not going to give away too much after that, but I can see now where the graphic quality of that writing came from. It came from the fact that you actually had your current wife in the towers at that time. In fact, I'm wondering if this would be a point at which you'd like to read a little bit from your novel, Tony. Would you like to do that?
I will read a small segment when
Excellent.
Ali comes back from Boston in search of his wife, Nancy, who was in the North Tower on 9/11. The FDR drive south is deserted, yet he drives slowly and cautiously. A shroud of despair descends over him as he exits on 96th Street and proceeds south on 2nd Avenue to 75th Street. The streets are an empty wasteland. It is as if all the inhabitants of this great city disappeared, pulverized into nothingness, or floated away into outer space. As he unlocks the door to his apartment, he feels cold and clammy. Sweat pours down his face and chest. He feels exhausted. His legs buckle, and he can barely keep his eyes open. He goes to the fridge and snaps open a can of Coca-Cola. He drinks its contents in one single long gulp. Where is Nancy? Could she have gone to her parents in Staten Island? He speed dials her mother. There is no dial tone. The Brooklyn Battery Tunnel and the Verrazano Bridge are closed. There is no way he can make it there. He will have to wait for the phone lines to be restored. As he stretches on the sofa, his eyes close involuntarily. He feels the dimming away of his consciousness as a dark film descends upon him. Ali finds himself walking into a canyon, an uneven mud road. The asphalt melted, piled up in heaps. Around him is a world of fire. The skyscrapers with their fiery walls and sagging windows like curtains of crimson flames. Men, women, and children, human fireballs dance around him. They beckon him as their burnt flesh oozes in rivers of molten flames. He runs away, his eyes shut, wherever his feet will carry him. When he opens his eyes, he sees buildings all burnt out and melted away, resembling trees of metal skewed. The roadside electrical poles are twisted into balls like tread reels. The cars are all misshaped, half dissolved, caked with ash and dust, the dust of a bright orange color. The sky is overcast. A light film of fog moves along the canyon, lit by a strange yellow glow. There is no sign of life anywhere. He walks quickly in this burnt-out canyon, looking on all sides for a trace of life. Where have all the people gone? Where am I? He enters what remains of a burnt-out building beside a fallen cracked statue of what looks like the face of Christopher Columbus. Is this Columbus Circle near the New York Coliseum? He carefully avoids the great pools of melted glass as he clambers through the ruins. He enters a large space, perhaps a solarium. He sees mangled cars and boats. Piles of twisted metal are all over, and in the middle, a large mass of what looks like flesh with tinges of orange and purple color, as if preserved of poison by some lethal chemical. The smell is acrid, the smell of liquefying bone. Frightened, he rapidly exits the building and begins to run. He feels thirsty and cold. Orange flakes of snow keep falling that burn like acid. He takes shelter on the sidewalk of a burnt-out building. Where am I? What has happened here? Suddenly, an animal passes by, a strange animal, its face macerated, dripping thick saliva like gel, the body that of a dog. Its frightened bright eyes move rapidly like ball bearings in an empty skull. The animal runs at a rapid galloping pace, like a horse startled at something it saw. Ali feels a shiver. He wakes up startled and in a sweat, the dream still vivid in his mind. He looks around, grappling with his surroundings. Gradually, the landscape draws him in and rapidly claims him as its own. He is in his apartment, safe and secure. He runs to the window and looks out at the East River. He is in New York, on the East Side. The world around him still stands. He is not in a post-apocalyptic world, a world illuminated by a strange yellow light, with shades of orange, without any remnants of human life. He then realizes what has happened.
Thank you, Tony. That was amazing. Thank you. It really so vividly brought back to my mind, at least, the horror of that day, of that afternoon. And I can recall walking myself from downtown, from NYU, about 40 blocks up to Grand Central to try to get a train to then get me home to Connecticut, and walking by the ashen faces, literally ashen, because people's faces and bodies were covered with ash. I think you've brought it out so beautifully. But I wanted to say that in addition to this being a novel about 9/11, this is also a medical novel in general, and a novel about cardiology in particular. And I was wondering to what extent your profession as a cardiologist came into the conception and the creation of this novel, because it can't just be a coincidence that you've made your protagonist a heart specialist. So would you like to talk about that as well?
Well, yes, cardiology did come quite a lot. Before I started writing this novel, I had written a poem many years back, Waiting for a Heart, which I never published. I had many patients waiting for a heart transplant, many of them who died before the advent of the internal defibrillator. And I was privy to their suffering, to their suffering and the suffering of their families. And I felt that the poem did not really do any justice. So I thought that a novel, it was always in the back of my mind, that a novel would indeed would do much better, at least come close to depicting their suffering. And that's what you find in Anna as she waits for a heart. and has to go through all these procedures, and the wait, for years is very long. So I think, in answer to your question, yes, my experience in cardiology had a lot to do with it. And of course, one of the things I have to add, one of the challenge when you write a novel which deals in medicine, because you know so much about it and you know the technical elements. Yes. And mine is a very specialized field. It's not only cardiology, it's cardiac electrophysiology, which is super specialized from cardiology. So I had to spend a lot of time in writing in a way that people would understand. And that was also as well challenging when you write a medical fiction.
Yes, I could definitely recognize that as I was reading the novel, and I kept thinking how difficult it would have been for you to avoid anything much too scholarly and to bring it down to the level of the layman. And I was particularly pleased to see the glossary at the back that you gave us that explained all of the terms, so that I kept trying to make sense of everything, and was very grateful for that glossary. But I think you did a very good job of not becoming too academic in your writing, and understanding that when you're writing fiction, it's a whole different kettle of fish, and that you have a completely different audience from the audience that would be reading your medical journals or your medical articles. But in addition to being a medical novel about cardiology, interestingly enough, this is also a novel about globalization. And I think that was evident in the fact that your protagonists are a Pakistani Muslim immigrant in New York who happens to have a Roman Catholic mother and therefore was exposed to Catholicism through her. You have a refugee ballerina from Russia, that's Anna. And then you have the white female American financial analyst, this wizard from New York who works on Wall Street. And they all come together through such interesting circumstances. So I was also wondering how much your background as an immigrant from India in the USA would have influenced you in your ability and your desire to bring such disparate characters together through this novel that's to a very large extent about the immigrant experience, the diasporic experience. What would you say about that?
Yes, indeed. I'm very much a product of globalization. I have within me several cultures. The Goan culture, the Portuguese, I speak Portuguese and write Portuguese, the Indian culture, and the British as well, because all my education and most of my reading and writing has been in the English language. It reminds me, V.S. Naipaul wasn't English. But when he went from Trinidad to England as a student, he looked for the world of Charles Dickens. So, we are very familiar with England and English literature as well, because we write English and we learned, we studied English all our lives. Mm-hmm. Everywhere from college. I obviously studied in high school in the Bombay of those times at St. Mary's, and had English as well as Irish priests as my teachers. And the New York world is a world of diaspora. So I enjoy, and I'm very much at ease with the Latin culture. I can be at home in Brazil and Portugal, as well as in Spain or Argentina. I speak Spanish as well. So I enjoy that element of bringing different characters of different cultures. And I think that New York pretty much represents that and gives you that opportunity. I find that challenging as well. Now, I have to add that I cannot tell you where Ali came from. I don't know. It may be that because of 9/11, but because of Ali, I also had to read the Quran. And I had to learn the surahs, because a lot of the surahs do appear in the novel. So that was challenging as well.
Yes, in fact, that was quite impressive. Your exposure to Islam, your understanding of the Quran, and the ease with which you quoted from the surahs at very relevant points in the novel. In fact, I was quite taken by the enormous amount of research that you've had to do. Cardiology is your field of specialization, yes, and of course you know that like the back of your hand. But in addition to that, there's Islam that you bring in through Ali, but there's also the world of professional ballet dancing, which forms a very significant part of your novel, and that's seen through your character Anna. In fact, Ali, coincidentally enough, your cardiologist, happened to train in ballet dancing himself when he was a little boy. And so I was wondering, where did this interest in ballet come from? Are you yourself a fan of ballet? And if so, how did the interest in ballet dancing develop? And with that, of course, your interest in classical Western music. And if not, if you're not a fan, then what sort of research did you have to do to be able to give your reader such a detailed understanding of the complexities of the world of a professional ballet dancer's life? I thought that would be something you'd like to speak to.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for asking that question. You know, I have had a love for the arts right from my childhood. I had attended ballet, before. But I think that my wife, as you know, Margarita, is more than half Russian. And ballet comes from Russia. And she introduced me to ballet, perhaps in a very special way. And I love the art form. When I was writing the novel, we went to St. Petersburg. And I went to the Mariinsky Theater. And I watched a ballet by the Kirov company, which, by the way, had also performed in New York, and I had watched. But I think that somewhere along the line, somewhere along the time, I was impressed by the art form, particularly the way the Russian ballerinas, they're classical ballerinas, their drama, their poise, their stature, the way they dance. And then this idea came to me that about Swan Lake, which is one of my favorite ballets, and that, it would be very dramatic if Anna collapses right on the stage during the dance,
Mm-hmm.
and turns out that she has heart failure and cardiomyopathy. So, as you know, ballet comes from Russia. So I think I was very impressed with the art form. Being that my wife is more than half Russians, I also have a lot of Russian friends. And I think I understand the Russian character rather well, particularly the female element of the Russian character. I also am a fan of Russian literature. I have read Russian poetry and literature, and I've read the works of Anna Akhmatova, who, by the way, does appear in the novel. Anna's mother has features of Anna Akhmatova, a new Anna Akhmatova, and part of her poem actually comes in the novel. Also the works of Mendelssohn, Pushkin, Chekhov, Dostoevsky, Bulgakov, Solzhenitsyn. I have read these writers and do commiserate with them in some ways.
That is incredible, Tony. It's amazing to me what an amalgam you are of so many different cultures, and not just so many different cultures, but so many different languages, and the ability that you have, to straddle so many of these different European worlds through your heritage and your study, and the fact that you've made it sort of your life's aim to enlarge your mind and enlarge your horizons in this way. It's remarkable how it then all comes into your creative work and seems to flow almost effortlessly. So that sort of very studied element of your writing is very evident to anybody, that almost erudite element. It was certainly evident to me as a scholar of literature myself. So, but I'd also like to say that apart from the intellectual aspect of this novel, it's also about the personal tragedies of your protagonists. You seem to be able to write about personal loss with great sensitivity and understanding of the subject. And I'm sure that that is partly due to the fact that you are a cardiologist and you've probably seen death occur, on the operating table, death before operations, death after operations, and you know what it is like to be exposed to the relatives and the next of kin who have to deal with loss in this way. But I was wondering to what extent you tap into your own personal losses when you write with such an understanding of the grieving process. And I hope it's not too much of an intrusion to ask if any aspects of your personal experience with loss has colored your ability to write with such deep empathy as you write, as you give us characters who are dealing with pain. So would you care to tell us something about that?
Yeah, sure. I think, the death of my wife had a profound effect on me. And I sort of internalized it. And it was about, my friends did not know, or they probably could not even fathom it. But that is, I think, the character of an Indian. It was about a year after that I began writing. And I never stopped. And perhaps, writing was my salvation in many ways. I recently was attending a Zoom reading of the book of Grace Schulman and another poet. And they also discussed the fact that writing for some, perhaps not for all, can be a salvation as well. There are other trials and tribulations in my life that perhaps were secondary. However, looking back, I'm a writer by birth. Genetically. Even in medicine, I would never be happy in private practice, just seeing patients. And for that very reason, probably subconsciously, I chose academic medicine so that I could think, I could research, and I could write my observations. I did not feel a sense of achievement after I became a doctor. But I did after I saw my first manuscript in print. And of course, besides, the tragedy that I went through, I have witnessed the tragedies of my patients who go through suffering. And through that, of course, there is a degree of detachment. As a doctor, you have to have a sort of a compartmentalization and a detachment, because otherwise it is very difficult to rationally think and to rationally make decisions. But I think in answer to your question, I think my empathy comes from my own loss. That is my answer to your question.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that with us.
Sure.
It is very evident to anybody who's reading this novel that this author, that this writer has experienced personal pain too, because that comes into the book through the very nuanced representation of grief management among the characters themselves. So it's no surprise to me that you say that you had a grievous loss in your own life and pretty early that you then had to deal with. I'm sure that many participants today are probably also wondering how you have managed to be such a prolific creative writer while also nurturing a thriving career as a cardiologist, and while being a renowned cardiac specialist at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York City and having published so many medical articles and medical books, you are a published poet and you are a novelist. And anybody who is a writer knows that that is, in fact, by itself a full-time profession. So I'm wondering how these two disciplines, science and the creative arts, coexist in your own life, and how you manage to make the time for both of them and to do both of them well. And I was wondering if you ever find yourself having to compromise one devotion in favor of the other, and whether you're ever torn between these two disciplines as you go through your life on a daily basis.
Well, that again, Rochelle, is a great question. I will start with a quote from the famous Russian writer Anton Chekhov, who also was a doctor, but certainly, he lived in the late 19th century, when medicine was not what medicine is today. But he wrote, and I quote, "Medicine is my lawful wife, and literature my mistress. When I get tired of one, I spend the night with the other." And that's exactly what applies to me. So, being in academia in a highly competitive environment and a prestigious institution, we wear a lot of hats. We see patients, we dictate letters to the referrals, we do research, we write papers on our research. If you're famous enough, you're invited to write review articles. We teach the fellows. If you're famous enough, you're on the editorial board of medical journals, you have to review those papers, you have to grade them, you have to grade abstracts. And if you're a director, you have to administer as well. So we wear a lot of hats. And, it gives us a lot of discipline. And we are able to compartmentalize. So I think that I did not really have to compromise. When I wrote this novel, by the way, I wrote it mostly at work. And I wrote it in between patients and in between procedures. Let's say that I did a procedure from 8 to 12 o'clock. I had lunch and I had the afternoon relatively free. I went back to my office, to my academic office, sat on my computer and began writing. And if I had to dictate a letter, whatever, I did all those things. And that's how it all happened. But I didn't have to compromise. I think that, well, if you ask me the question, if I was born in the United States, I might have become a writer and not a doctor. But certainly, I don't regret. Doctoring has given me a lot, and also a phenomenal perspective in both science and the humanities, because at the end, doctoring is a part of humanity.
Yeah, I think that's so true. And I think that I was wondering, given that you have these two disciplines that you say, require this almost miraculous juggling act, as you put it so beautifully, between a wife and a mistress, it probably leaves you very stressed, because I can just imagine what a man who has to juggle his time between these two forces goes through. But this arc, the arc of your plot, I was wondering whether it was driven by an overall plan that you had at the beginning when you began to write the novel, and whether it was in any way influenced by your characters, because a lot of writers will tell you that my characters took over my novel, and they will tell you that the characters then started to dictate to me how I should proceed. Now, I was wondering whether you had this overall plan when you began and stuck with it and focused on it, or whether in fact you found yourself surprised by the direction that your plot was taking as your manuscript progressed. What was the arc, in other words, of your plot?
Absolutely, that's a great question. And I really enjoy answering this question, because unlike science, this was novel writing, particularly literary novel writing, is very different. No, not at all. I didn't have a plot at all. I think that I got the idea of, I knew that this was going to be about heart transplant. And I knew that I had to have a character who was going to have heart failure and in need of heart transplant. And that's all I knew. I also knew that I would have had to have a doctor. Then Anna came into the picture, and then Ali came into the picture, and then the characters took over. I did not know how it was going to how the arc of the story would develop. That was purely the characters taking over the writer, and that happens in the first draft. And then after that, you do control the characters. You cut some stuff, or you decide that this suits this character, whereas this doesn't really jive with this character. So then you do take control over the story and the characters, but actually it is all driven, the story is driven by the characters, and you get surprised. Even now, when I read the novel, I get surprised that I wrote this. And where the hell did that come from? And when did it come from? And I don't know the answer. I think that it's fascinating when I think about it, about writing. In one of the Zoom meetings that I have, sorry to digress, but one of the, somebody said, who's a writer, that writing is a disease. I don't look at it as a disease. I look at it as a trait, basically, that you have a painter who loves to paint, you have a writer who loves to write, and you have a pianist who loves to play the piano. So it is a trait, and novel writing is fascinating. I think that in the mind, all of us, there is a lot of subconscious memory in our mind. And most of us don't explore it. But when we write, these things come, and they surface, and you don't know where they're coming from. It is very akin to a dream. The other day, I dreamt about my cousin, who I met, when I was 7 years old. I don't know why the hell he came into my dream. I have no idea. This after maybe more than 50, 60 years. So coming back to that, I think that there is a lot that it's fascinating the way the characters take over and they themselves develop the story, and you're only a vehicle in the process.
Yeah, good, interesting. But talking about how your characters drive you in a certain direction, you also in your acknowledgements talk about the Two Bridges Creative Writers Group, and you talk about your work with them, and that they helped you edit and assemble this novel and bring it together. So I was wondering whether they had a great role to play themselves in taking your novel in a certain direction. So it's not just the characters, it's your early readers, it's people who are giving you ideas when they're looking at your drafts. And I was wondering whether you think that every writer needs to have this kind of a creative writing group to bounce ideas off and then to review the chapters while the manuscript is in the making. So to what extent do you think this creative writers group had a hand in the shape that your novel eventually took?
No, I don't think that they had a hand in assembling the novel. I think that they might have made some suggestions that this chapter may be redundant, or this slows the novel. Why don't you take this out? Or why don't you put something in that respect? And some degrees, some of the people some of the writers in the workshop found of editing. They may change your comma and semicolon or something of that sort, but not really in assembling the novel. But I think that it is important to be a part of a creative writing group, because for the simple reason that you get a feedback. And you know that when you write, you have a lot of doubts about yourself, about what you've written. And that, the writing groups helps in that regard. They will say that they like it, they will say that they don't. And at the end of it all, you take something with a grain of salt, and you take something that does make sense to you, and you may make changes. And I must say that friends and family are no substitution for a creative writing group, because it's just like, it's very akin to present a paper to a group of doctors versus presenting something to lay people, who may not appreciate your expertise in the area, or who may not understand you at all. So friends and family, they may read it and they'll say it's great or whatever, but you need, I think it's a good idea to have a writing group.
Absolutely. So that also brings me to my next question. Apart from bouncing ideas off this creative writers group and taking their advice, or perhaps rejecting their advice, have you taken any other creative writing courses as you try to develop your writing skills in the early years, or perhaps even now that you're semi-retired? Or are you entirely self-taught, perhaps? I'm not really sure how you came to have an understanding of the craft of novel writing. Was it simply through practice? Did practice make you more adept at working out the kinks in your writing? Or how did that all happen for you as a cardiologist also working as a writer?
Sure. I just want to add one more thing to your last question. Most of science is objective, but almost all of poetry and fiction, novels are subjective. They're not objective things. So for the writer, he has to keep into perspective that some people are going to like it, some people are not going to like it, and some people are going to love it, you see. So that's something that a writer needs to keep into perspective. No, in answer to your question, no, I have not had any training. I don't have any degree in the humanities. I haven't gone to an MFA program, and I'm pretty much self-taught. And the way I was self-taught is basically, of course, it's very ambitious to write a novel, but I'm glad that I came from poetry to fiction. And I felt that poetry is very personal, and I had written my share of personal life, or personal feelings, and I noticed that my poems were becoming longer. And I have to say that in 1980, you see, I did write poetry when I was in college. And I just shared a few poems with a very close friend of mine who is a theoretical physicist and also a poet, and we have been lifelong friends. And what happened is that then I went to medicine, and medicine is a very intense field. So for the next, until 1984, I had not read a book, a novel, or nothing, a poem, nothing. I totally, it was out of my life. In 1984, I read V.S. Naipaul's A House for Mr. Biswas. And at that time, I felt that I should write a novel about Goa. And I sat down, of course, it was the days before the computer, so I started writing, and it was horrible. It was really terrible. I wrote a few pages and, I just forget it, I said. And then I Then I went back, obviously, after my wife died. So I had to start all over again. I only had read Shakespeare, Milton, Barrett Browning, and some more British poets, and of course, Rabindranath Tagore. And that was all. Okay, so in 1990, I started on a project on my own of reading current poets, poets of the Middle Ages and current poets. And I did it on my own, obviously. And then, of course, I felt that it was time to write a novel. And I took on the Sting of Peppercorns, and it was very hard. And I learned the technique of novel writing. So now I am an expert pretty much. I can do it in less than 1/4 of the time, I think. And there is a lot of, as you know, there's a lot of technique in novel writing. So no, I don't have an MFA program. And therefore, when I've been asked this question, have I been influenced by any writer? No, I haven't. I like some writers, I don't like others, but I don't think that anybody has influenced me in any strong way.
Well, Tony, I have to tell you that I could talk to you forever, and I could ask you a dozen more questions, and this interview would continue to flow in this fashion. But I think we have participants who are also keen to ask you questions, and I'm going to now turn the floor over to them so that Christine, who will moderate the questions, will then turn them over to you, and you can then respond to our participants. So let's move on to that aspect now of this interview.
Sure.
Thank you, Rochelle, and thank you, Tony, for the great interview. So let's see, I do see we have some questions in the Q&A. The first one here is, was there ever a time where you did not want to continue writing, where there were hindrances that stopped you from completing your book? How did you know when to stop writing? When were you satisfied with your plot, setting, and how the novel ended?
That's a very good question. I would say no. I had doubts, all along. And obviously, it is important to have doubts. If you start with doubts, I think that you'll end up with certainties. If you start being absolutely certain, then you will end up, nowhere. So I think that I did have doubts. And as I said before, I knew that the novel was about heart transplant, but how that would occur, and whether I think that 9/11 came into that vision, basically, and a decision that Ali had to make about donating his heart. And obviously, he agonizes about it, whether he should donate her heart to Anna. And I'm not going to go into that. There is only one sentence which says it all. And I'm not going to tell you that sentence. I think it is for the reader to find out. But it is there. It is there. So I think that as I went along, and as I said, that the characters drove the story, I think that I wrote the novel in 1.5 years. Okay, and then the other years that I spent was rewriting and revision. I think that I probably, the novel was written or re-revised about 2 years back. But then I didn't send it out, or I sent it out, you see, as you know, to send a novel, to get a novel published in the US through a commercial publisher, you need to have an agent. And to have an agent is a fishing expedition. Mm-hmm. Is a fishing expedition in an ocean. And particularly a novel like this, because most American agents are very focused on their culture, and they don't understand other cultures. So it is much more difficult in a novel such as this. But luckily, nowadays we have independent publishers, which are as good and to some extent even better than the commercial publishers, because the commercial publishers are pretty much in trouble because of Amazon and independent publishers and self-publishing. I don't like self-publishing. I think it's pretty much of a cop-out in many ways, and you don't have the feedback. But there are excellent independent publishers now. So I think that over the course of time, the story unraveled. And I think that the writer himself realizes or knows when it is over. So I have two pieces of advices for young writers or who want to be writers. First is that writing is rewriting and rewriting and rewriting. Mm-hmm. Don't ever think that because you've written, that's it, that your first draft, it looks wonderful to you in the beginning. The second piece of advice is after you've written, whether it's a short story, it's a novel, save it and forget about it for at least 1 month. It's even better if it's longer. And read it again. It's like a fresh reading, you see. And you'll find that either it's bad or it's not good, and you have to work on it. Of course, journalistic writing is very different. I'm talking about literary writing, particularly fiction and nonfiction as well. The same thing applies. I hope I've answered your question.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Tony. Next question is, writing is a lonely job. How true was that for you?
Well, yes, it is a lonely job. There's no question about it. But it's also, it takes you into another world. And to me, it is a wonderful world. It's a highly creative world. Science obviously is a highly creative world as well, but it's a different world where it's an objective world. Writing, depends if you're writing nonfiction or writing fiction or writing an essay. But nonetheless, yes, it is a lonely world. There's no question about it. It's your world. It's very internal, but it's enjoyable and it's challenging. Of course, look, I'm not. I wouldn't classify myself as a professional writer. So I am a doctor cardiologist. And there is also another thing which is very important. I didn't depend financially on my writing. And that, I think, is another element. So for me, there is no hurry, to write a novel, because I know that I'm not dependent on it. I'm not going to make money from it. Or I don't give a damn if it makes money or not. I write for the pleasure of it. Now, for full-time writers, that's a different situation altogether. They depend on it financially. So they have much more angst and much more pressure and much more, what should I say, more difficulties, because they depend on the finances. And if you look at professional novelists, they produce one novel every 3 years. And they live from the advance of the previous novel for those 3 years until they get a new novel. With me, it was different, obviously. So I don't fall into that category. I don't know how those people handle it, but I didn't have that. I was lucky in many ways. I had something that I could live on and earn the money, and I could take my own time and my own pleasure at my own free will.
Thanks. Thank you, Tony. Do we have any other questions, Christine?
We do. We have a bit more, but we are unfortunately running out of time. So I think maybe we'll take just 2 more.
Okay.
So I apologize, everyone. So this next question is, have you now written a novel about Goa that you were satisfied with?
Yes, of course, The Sting of Peppercorns. I mean, that was my first novel. And by the way, that went through a lot of changes. Because that, writing that novel, I was at the same time learning how to write. So, for example, the novel, the version that was published in Goa is written in the third person. The version that is published in India, in New Delhi, is written in the first person. And the version, the Portuguese version that was published in Portugal and in Brazil simultaneously is written in the first person of the doctor. I have now realized that my niche is indeed medicine, which I know the most, and my 2 novels have had doctors as characters. So yes, that novel is written, that novel is published both in Goa, in Portugal, in Brazil, and in India as well, in New Delhi. It's The Sting of Peppercorns, and it's available on Amazon.
Yeah, and I can vouch for that because I thought The Sting of Peppercorns is one of the best novels I've ever written or I've ever read about the liberation of Goa. The history of modern Goa has been so graphically brought out in that novel. And as Tony says, it goes across from Portugal to Goa. The whole colonial background is explored. And then we come to the modern period with the liberation of Goa in independent India. So I would very much recommend that people who are interested by this interview and interested in Tony's work, look at The Sting of Peppercorns as well.
Great, thank you. Okay, our last question is, what is the next project idea? Do you have other stories floating around in your head?
Yeah, of course. I am writing a novel right now, a novella, which actually has already been written, I think in a matter of 6 months and less than 6 months. And that's because I'm sort of like very comfortable and I know the techniques and everything. And it's titled Dr. Delirium, actually. And there is another project that I have already working on, and it's a novel about COVID. And again, you see, my agent asked me to write it fast, but just like 9/11, I think that it is too raw for people to read because we are, as you know, this pandemic has been terrible. The suffering of people, there is so much here, the deaths, the loneliness, dying all by yourself without your family. These are very difficult and tragic times. And I don't feel that people will be ready, it's very raw. And I don't know, I think that I can finish the whole novel in another 3 or 4 months, more than 3/4 or half of it is written. But I don't know whether that I have to think quite a bit, whether it'll be ready, to go out, to get published and so on. So those are the 2 projects. I have a collection of essays that I've written. And I think, by the way, I have to mention this, I forgot. I have another book which is due the end of this month, and it's going to be published by Springer Nature, which is, the title of the book is Rhythms of Broken Hearts. And it is a combination of science and humanity. It is mostly the stories of my patients, and how they dealt with their disease, and how they coped, how I treated them. And that book should come out, I think, in the summer of this year.
Wonderful.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Thank you. All right. Well, I think we need to get wrapped up. We unfortunately have gone over time, but this was a really wonderful discussion. Thank you so much, Tony, and thank you so much, Rochelle. This was really great. And thank you everyone for joining us. Take care.
Thanks.
I just
Thank
want
you to our
to
audience.
say 2 words. I want to thank you for organizing this interview, and obviously to thank Rochelle. I think that we could talk for a whole day. It's very rare that you have this opportunity to talk writer to writer, and somebody who has read your work. So I'm deeply moved. And thank you.
My pleasure. It's been my pleasure entirely. To do this session has been a pleasure. It's always great to be a part and to host the Meet the Author events. And thank you, Christine. Thank you to the committee that works so hard to bring these events to the public. And thank you, Pequot Library, and to all of you for being present. It was such a pleasure, Tony. Good luck with this new novel, and may it sail out into the world with much success.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for the committee for inviting me. I'm deeply honored.
Thank you so much, Tony. Take care. Thanks, Rochelle. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Bye, everyone. Thank you.